is indeed a great pleasure to join this August gathering, and I'm thankful to UNDP for having me here. As I think I must congratulate Ali and Haley for this wonderful, very robust working paper that Ali has just presented. I think from a manufacturing or private sector led economist perspective, I think the paper really focuses on some very important pertinent issues which have also been of high relevance for countries in Asia, countries such as Bangladesh and Vietnam, the two countries I'm going to focus on today in sharing how they maneuver their path to economic growth, banking on the manufacturing and broader private sector-led pathway, and what lessons, what were the success factors behind their economic progress. So I have a presentation which I'm just going to. As our sort of colleagues put up the slides, let me sort of also say why I think this is so timely and so relevant an initiative and a working paper or a presentation that Ali and Haley have just sort of delivered. I think in Asia we have been hearing about the growing potential of Ethiopia over the last few years as a potential economic player in East Africa and a potential strong player in the global value chain through potential exports and so on. And there are so many similarities with the path that Bangladesh and Vietnam, or even to some extent India, have sort of treaded over the last few decades to come where they are today. And I think Ali's paper focus on binding constraints and then investment climate specific issues are so right to talk about. And I see a lot of common issues there, bureaucracy, the macro governance, land, trade logistics or overall logistics issues and so on. They have all been part and parcel of Bangladesh and Vietnam's growth story and how they sort of handle it to come where they are, and parts of which they are still trying to resolve. So the manufacturing and export-led economic growth, lessons from Bangladesh and Vietnam. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we are going to see what this success or what this growth story sort of entails. We're going to look at what was behind this, what was propelling this growth path, and what are the lessons that are coming out from both Bangladesh and Asia. So next slide, please. So Bangladesh, which is a 52-year-old country, having been independent since 1971, it has actually secured a very impressive development performance over the last few decades. It secured a triple dividend, if I may, in terms of development performance, consistent high growth, which is about 5% average over the last 30 years. Faster poverty reduction from 49% poverty rate in the year 2000 to only 18% in 2022. And thirdly, very strong human development, very strong human capital development, which actually makes Bangladesh not only a sort of a model of economic development, but also social development. Just to share an example, Bangladesh, according to the World Economic Forum, is the most gender empowered country in South Asia. So if you look at the gender empowerment or equality index, you'll see Bangladesh at the very top in terms of where it stands among the South Asian countries. And the gender issue, addressing the gender issue, is not easy in South Asian context, both cultural and religious context, and being the most gender empowered country is quite a feat over there. Next slide, please. Now, this development journey, the triple dividend I've just mentioned, faster growth, strong human capital development, and fast and very fast economic poverty alleviation. This was greatly benefited by the trade and investment journey, which is the private sector-led journey in this country. Over the 5 decades, the GDP grew by 35 times, per capita income more than 18 times, Bangladesh, which is a small country but with a large population, only 55,000 square miles, but almost 180 million people. It has been losing on an average 1% of arable land per year over the last 50 years. Yet, it managed to significantly increase in its agricultural output, almost closer to 6 times, to feed a population of 175, 180 million from that of 70 million when it became independent 50 years ago. During the last 3 decades, the 4 decades, the trade GDP ratio doubled from 18 to 36%. At one point, it went up as high as 43, 44%. And at the same time, the manufacturing contribution in the GDP went up by more than 3 times, from 7% in the early 70s to more than 24% in the latest year. Next slide, please. If we also look where this development progress, banking on rising purchasing power, rising income and sort of wealth, as well as rising social empowerment, got Bangladesh too. One great example of global endorsement is how organizations like HSBC or Boston Consulting Group see Bangladesh in the next few years. So according to both of these institutions, Bangladesh is set to become the 9th largest consumer market globally, which denotes the prosperity and the wealth and the income growth, and certainly backed by expansion of formal employment, which was possible by this private sector-led growth, banking on manufacturing and international trade. Next slide. And sort of banking on this very sort of strong development and economic progress, Bangladesh is now preparing to transition from labor intensive manufacturing as well as low volume, low value products to actually skill-based manufacturing elements, and also knowledge-based economy, particularly taking advantage of the digital economy wave globally as well as in South Asia. If you look at some of the digital readiness strength or pillars of Bangladesh, there's 130 million internet subscribers. Mobile phone penetration is 75%, with almost 50% of them having of total population having digital experience and smart mobile phone. 4.5 million transactions daily through digital financial services, and 16% of world's online workers coming from Bangladesh. So what got Bangladesh to get to this level, particularly in the manufacturing, and from manufacturing to where it now wants to transition to, from labor-intensive manufacturing to skill-intensive, and to that of the services sector, banking on the digital economy, right? Next slide, please. Next slide. So let's unbundle what this manufacturing, primarily led by private sector, what this manufacturing or private sector-led success look like for Bangladesh. If you look at the growth, employment, investment, supply chain, predominantly dominated by the private sector players. More than 75% of the country's investment comes from private sector. If you look at a very sort of important sector, enabler sector, energy, and including power, which was till 1999, just until 25 years ago, 100% public sector owned and operated, currently has 55% of the power generated by the private sector power producers. Of course, Bangladesh still has to go a long way in terms of transmission as well as distribution improvement and getting private sector there. But also, some of the non-traditional sectors such as aviation, 74% of the market is private sector. Majority of the schools and clinics or sort of mid-sized, small and mid-sized hospitals are all private sector. And if you look at the digital infrastructure, which is preparing Bangladesh for both digital manufacturing as well as digital sort of services, exports and outputs. It is almost overwhelmingly, whether it's broadband, mobile telephony, or similar ones, it's all private sector led. The food sector, which was almost 100% public sector dominated till mid-80s, currently is dominated again by the private sector, whether it's seeds or distribution, or if you look at the sort of the rice meals. The rice is the staple food in Bangladesh. More than 100,000 private sector rice mills, which are sort of value adding to the sort of cultivation and sort of turning it into rice and then putting it into distribution. And the agri supply chain is 100% private sector dominated. Next slide, please. In the manufacturing, if you go dive deeper into the manufacturing, as I mentioned in my intro, the manufacturing contribution in GDP rose from 7% in the early 70s to more than 24%, sort of 3.5 times increase. And during this time, manufacturing GDP growth in manufacturing sector, or manufacturing GDP growth, went up almost by 3 times, from 4.3% to 12.31%, denoting manufacturing expansion over the years for Bangladesh. Next slide, please. If you look at now, a big part of the manufacturing, particularly formal one and the globally integrated one, is ready-made garments, but is also now shared by leather and footwear, plastics products like plastics as intermediate, light manufacturing products, and so on, like electrical and electronics. If you look at Bangladesh's merchandise exports coming from the manufacturing sector, it has increased almost 10 times over the last 2 decades, from little over $5 billion to almost $56 billion in the last fiscal year, which ended June this year. And during this time, Bangladesh also penetrated into very advanced markets, such as 95% of Bangladesh's ready-made garment products go to the European Union and the North American markets, the United States and Canada. If you look at leather and footwear, it's going to East Asian markets like Japan, again Europe, and sort of a very non-traditional sector for export, which is coming up recently, pharmaceuticals. Bangladesh had 180 million people, large sort of health care product market, including medicines here, and it's almost self-sufficient except for very sophisticated drugs such as cancer drugs and so on. Bangladesh now exports about more than $450–500 million of pharmaceutical product. The number may be small given Bangladesh's overall export of $56 billion. It's rising very fast, but more importantly, it goes to about 103 different markets, countries. So giving you a sense of how diversified this is. But at a time, I must also highlight that Bangladesh has been struggling to diversify its product basket, export product basket. Till today, 83–84% of the total exports come from ready-made garments. Now, that is, some consider that as a great strength or a sign of competitive advantage, which made Bangladesh the second largest exporter of ready-made garments in the world after China. But many, including me, would see that as a highly risky composition for the world that we are stepping into, as well as the world that we will have in the next few decades, where concentration in one particular product, no matter how competitive that area might be for the country, poses very significant risk. Next slide, please. So, as I say, what are the sort of, how did Bangladesh get there? What were the building blocks for Bangladesh to get to this private sector-led economic growth, where manufacturing played a very important role? Next slide, please. If you look at Bangladesh's policy stance, the policy orientation, that played a very important role. Right after the independence, Bangladesh adopted more often, so all industries were nationalized. The country adopted a socialist economic pathway, and there were very little, almost none in private sector for manufacturing. There were only traders who had to operate under very strict economic regulations, licensing and many other restrictions. From that, in the late 70s, came what I consider the phase 1.0 that contributed to Bangladesh's manufacturing growth. And this 1.0 involved creating the foundations for the three important growth drivers. First and foremost, the agricultural productivity and agri-supply chain. I think that's where productivity was emphasized upon. I think not only food security, but also agriculture and agribusiness as a means of income for a large part of the population that relied on agriculture for their living. That came, but with that also came is the agri-supply chain for a large and growing population. And the privatization orientation started from this point onwards as well. The second growth driver was embracing the opportunity on ready-made garments, which really transitioned from Sri Lanka to Bangladesh in the late 70s, due to the sort of civil war that started in Sri Lanka, and also presence of a very important factor of productivity, which is large pool of very low wage labor, low cost labor, and Bangladesh sort of latched onto that very well. The third one was Bangladesh looked at sending out migrant workers to countries which required large number of primarily unskilled workers at that point, for which Bangladesh had plenty of resources, and this opened up the remittances, which kind of grew to almost a $40 billion market, half of which comes through formal channels, and half of which still comes through informal channels, which as of last year. But what this $40 billion did to the Bangladesh economy is that because these are sent by the migrant workers to their families for covering their day-to-day expenditure, but also to sort of invest in some of the basic assets one can have, such as a house, piece of land, and then as consumption grew into other products such as cosmetics, processed food, and so on, this $40 billion a year, as of last year, played a very important role in creating a large domestic market, domestic consumption, which led to a number of diversified industries: food, cosmetics, services, entertainment, tourism, and so on. Along with these three growth drivers, all these three growth drivers, as well as the overall private sector development strategy, made a transition from this economic regulations to prudential regulations through denationalization. And at the same time, this moved towards the late 80s, what came is trade liberalization, some broad supporting policies, higher order supporting policies, such as trade liberalization, supporting fiscal policies, including supporting policies for the government to be able to have the money to spend on growth supporting investment projects. So the VAT law was introduced right at the cusp of 1991, which really enabled the government revenue system or the revenue position to significantly strengthen, enabling government to invest in roads, in power, and so on. And at the same time, I think government started putting special emphasis on supporting policies such as the National Industrial Policy, which comes for every 3 years, export policies and import policies, and so on. And also in the late 80s or early 90s, what started is the private participation in telecom in infrastructure, which have been until that moment completely private sector owned and delivered. So first came the telecom sector with the mobile phones sector bringing in private participation, both foreign and local investment, and in the mid-90s or late 90s, as I mentioned, the power generation and so on. The 2.0, the phase 2.0, the supporting ecosystem, which I call 2.0, came in the early 2000s. This until I would say until 5 or 7 years back, till 2015 or 2016. After which we have seen some regressive policies, but we would like to think these are short term, and we will go back perhaps to the policy phase 3.0 for digital economy, green economy, diversification, and so on. But in the 2.0, what came is very strong industrial and connectivity infrastructure. The entire Bangladesh got connected by rural roads network, which created the rural economy and the consumption, overall the consumption part in the GDP and the, which fueled the growth of diversified domestic industries. That came in that point, in this point. But also connectivity infrastructure such as inland container, expansion of inland container ports, the dry ports, connecting hinterland, creating storages, and also some new port terminals, including a couple of small ports, also came up around this time. Banking on the rising purchasing power, the rising remittances, the multiplier effect of the ready-made garment industry, which created 4 million jobs by mid-2000s and another 4 to 6 million indirect jobs. That all created demand for multiple products and services. So industry started taking sort of diversified path, pharmaceutical, agro-processing, as I mentioned, for export, leather and footwear, construction. I think the construction boom started significantly from the late 90s, and it is still continuing at a very strong pace. Bangladesh is in the need for a few million housing units between last year and 2030, and I think the entire construction ecosystem grew very strongly on the bank of this huge market demand as well as increasing purchasing power. But this is the time when Bangladesh also got increasing global integration in its trade measures. So more of the trade liberalization came, more of integration came in terms of skills and expertise, and also financial services. Ali mentioned very rightly, financial services or growth finance is a big part and parcel of getting a strong manufacturing sector. What Bangladesh did early on, from late 80s, it opened up the financial sector for foreign financial institutions. So likes of HSBC, the Citibank NA, the Standard Chartered Bank, and many others, they came into the country by mid-90s. And I think that created a sophistication among the, through the competition as well as through the interaction and more partnership that created sort of a great development on the domestic financial institution side. I mean, that said, Bangladesh still has to do or has to go a long way in terms of developing long-term finance products, meeting the SME finance need. But when as far as manufacturing and trade or export-oriented businesses are concerned, they've been well catered by the growing financial services of the country. Next slide, please. I spent a little bit extra time on this slide because this was important. Some more policies, as you see. So ready-made garment, as I mentioned, it's the second largest in the world. The Bangladesh is one. Last year, out of the 56 billion total export, 83% or 46 billion was from the ready-made garment sector. Bangladesh is well poised to become a $100 billion RMG sector, ready-made garment sector by 2030. Why I say that? If you look at McKinsey's study on purchasing managers of the big global brands or global brands overall, that what their top three sourcing destination will continue to be between 2020, this was done in 2019, between 2020 and 2026, the number one was Bangladesh. Second, the cost competitiveness remains very strong. Although Bangladesh has to catch up its competitor economies or competitors on productivity, but even after adjusting for productivity, Bangladesh's cost competitiveness remains very strong. So, just to give you a sense, China, which is really the number one and far ahead of Bangladesh, even on RMG, the difference between first and second is quite big. China has more than 30% of global RMG market share, and the second largest Bangladesh has 6%. But Bangladesh's labor cost is still 72% cheaper than China, 24% cheaper than Vietnam. What really helped this RMG sector to grow? Several policies, for example, to removal of trade-related restrictions, licensing, quotas, and so on, and which were prioritized for ready-made garment sector, and later on some other high-priority sectors such as leather footwear, light manufacturing, and so on. Introduction of regulatory innovations to address capital shortages. For example, what is called back-to-back letter of credit, whereby the buying institution or the buying entity sends raw materials as part of a letter of credit, the exporting entity from Bangladesh uses the same letter of credit to export his or her goods, and as a result, it removes the requirement for LC margin, letter of credit, or import margins, which would have been very high in the early 80s or late 80s when the sector was growing. But because this was removed through this trade financing innovation, the capital requirement for import financing, at least, was not a barrier for the growing R&D sector. Similarly, what is called bonded warehouse regime, another innovation. Many countries have now done this. This is to deal with high import taxes of raw materials, intermediate goods, capital machineries. They were really high when the sector was growing, late 70s, 80s, mid 90s. They have been significantly slashed overall tariff rationalization. However, the high priority export sectors such as RMG, they were provided with this bonded warehouse regime, a regulatory regime, facility whereby the inputs required for export could all be imported for free of taxes. As long as they're to be exported, no taxes needed to be paid. So that played an important role, but I also wanted to bring up something, a macro supporting element, which Ali very rightly identified in his presentation. The macro is really important to sort of provide a stable foundation. So foreign exchange management, I see that Ali in his constraints identified foreign exchange management is an issue. Now, foreign exchange management or the fiscal prudence is really important. And Bangladesh government, I think prudent macroeconomic management has always been a strength of Bangladesh's economic policy. Of course, in the last 1.5 years, it's coming under very strong test as Bangladesh is facing some strong headwinds on the macro. But on the fiscal side, Bangladesh always managed its fiscal deficit to be within 5%, considered as a sort of a strong indicator of good fiscal management. Bangladesh also kept its foreign exchange regime very competitive. It devalued continually, every few years. Of course, the rate, many would argue, since 2013 or 2014, did not see as much depreciation or adjustments as it was needed, and as a result, we faced a sort of foreign exchange shock from July last year, and 31% depreciation in the local currency. That never happened in the 5 decades of Bangladesh's overall economic management. But overall, prudent macro governance is very important. Next slide, please. Again, from the 2000s, I think this has been happening at a steady pace, but it gathered significant pace after the 2000s or the late part of the first decade in the millennium. If you look at the power generation, which is really the backbone of manufacturing industry, right, everywhere in the world, and this was a binding constraint for Bangladesh until 2004 or 5. The demand far outweighs the generation, and they were almost hiatus in terms of increasing generation until a certain time. But I think from 2008 or 9, significant focus has been allocated to this, and as a result, from a 5,000 megawatt capacity, which was the fiscal year 2005, the country reached a whopping 25,000, almost 25,000 megawatt by February 2021. And as let me highlight again, 55% of this comes from the private sector. Next slide, please. Some of the examples of growth supporting infrastructure, I think $40 billion are going into ports, nuclear power plants, urban infrastructure such as metro rail or rail connectivity between production center, tourism centers, and the growth center. Just to give you an example, the Railway Act is going to be reformed in February, in 3 months' time, which will allow private participation in every aspects of railway development operations, but more importantly, on rail-based logistics. Ali very rightly captured on the issue of logistics. It is perhaps one of the top 3 or 4 determinant of both domestic, perhaps one of the top 1 or 2 determinant of global competitiveness. And Bangladesh is now finally focusing. It has been late to focus on logistics, but it has now stepped up on logistics. A national platform has been put together, and it's looking at both sea-based logistics, but also interland connectivity, warehousing, inland port, inland terminals, multimodal transports, and so on. Next slide, please. And I wanted to also say that during this time, industrial parks played a very important role. In the 80s and 90s, the export processing zone created a center of excellence, island of excellence, in terms of better investment climate, in terms of faster services, and in terms of better labor relations, and also higher productivity. And the same is now being replicated at a higher level or a wider scale through special economic zones regime, removing the barrier of export orientation only to bring in the growing domestic economy. Some of the key lessons coming up, and Ali has been a big part in developing these lessons, which came as part of the World Bank Group analytics 2-3 years ago. What is really important is Bangladesh's private sector taking the lead in terms of greater global orientation and also domestic opportunities, which were all supported very strongly by the government through development policies which were conducive for the manufacturing growth. Next slide, please. Very quickly, we go to the Vietnam story, because that is the latest Asian miracle, or the list of miracles from East Asia. Vietnam perhaps is the latest or the most talked about star at the moment. What led to Vietnam's success? It's a combination of holistic reforms, economic and business, supported by improvement in trade competitiveness and a special focus on foreign direct investment, which was key not only for finance or capital, more importantly for technology, but most importantly for market access. Accessing markets where Vietnamese were not known earlier, and hence sort of lacked customer or client confidence. The foreign investment, the foreign brands solved that problem, but it also provided the capital and the technology in many sort of new sectors. Next slide, please. As I said, Vietnam is the latest star. Their economic growth is a stellar one, and a great example of export, but primarily manufacturing export-led economic example. They're banking on this. Their per capita income, as you see, have increased almost 20 times. But during this time, their exports actually went perhaps went up by more than 30 times. Next slide, please. If you look at their overall trade figures now, it's a whopping almost $650 billion, where they exported more than $337 billion just last year. And just to give you put things into perspective or give you a better sense, in the year 2000 or 99, Bangladesh and Vietnam, both exports were actually at par. And look, in 22, 23 years where they have gone. Of course, Bangladesh has also improved, as I said, almost 9.5 times. But look at Vietnam, more than $300 million of export. And during this time, they have been exporting strongly and also importing, very sophisticated markets, US, China, ASEAN countries, banking on the very strong East Asian regional integration, which is a problem in South Asia, particularly at Bangladesh or India or Nepal. We are not able to take as much advantage of the intra-regional trade as countries in ASEAN would be doing. Vietnam was at the forefront in taking advantage of that. Next slide, please. If you look at Vietnam, what a spectacular story of diversification. Look at Bangladesh on the left and Vietnam on the right in terms of composition of their exports, in terms of sectors. Bangladesh, as I mentioned, 83% is steel, ready-made garment. You see just two sort of subsectors, meat and non-meat apparels, and then there are a few other sub-products in the R&D category. These two only are 82%. If you look at Vietnam, it's so well diversified. The electrical or electronics, which is 32%, that's about it. Their largest is 32%, where Bangladesh's largest is 84%. So Vietnam, kind of imparts a lesson and a success story, which is to be followed by many countries, not only Ethiopia, but even for Bangladesh. And what really made it possible is an integrated trade and investment strategy. They developed those policies and strategies hand in hand. If there was to be a manufacturing plan or a manufacturing sectoral plan, they looked at how much of potential they have on trade and what is the potential in terms of exports. Similarly, when they were looking at free trade agreements or other global or bilateral or regional agreements, they looked at how that particular agreement can be best leveraged, or opportunity opened by those agreements can be best leveraged by having the manufacturing or the services capability behind the border, so that the agreement doesn't remain only in the papers, but it is acted upon and it's capitalized upon. And that takes us where we have today in terms of this economic complexity, what you see, the composition of the export basket for Vietnam. So the integrated trade and investment policies, which were developed, reviewed, adjusted hand in hand, led to development of many competitive sectors, and as a result, Vietnam now has a very diversified sector. Just the electrical, electronics, or light manufacturing last year was $114 billion. It all started with a Samsung coming into Vietnam just 10 years ago, 2012, maybe 2013. And that Samsung was followed by 176 Korean light manufacturing, electronic, and electrical supply chain actors, which then kick-started Vietnam's overall electronics, electrical, and light manufacturing sector. On the food and agri, by 2019, Vietnam's overall agribusiness, forestry, and food exports went up to close to $40 billion, and so on. Next slide, please. Yes, just some examples. Malaysia used to be a great electronic and computer hardware and other components producer. Japanese companies diversified into Malaysia many decades ago, but look at where Vietnam is now and Malaysia is now in terms of its export. More than 100 billion for Vietnam, whereas Malaysia is still halfway through. Next slide, please. So, a host of policies, as I say, holistic reform, trade competitiveness, FDI. Vietnam's very famous economic reform package called Doing Moi in their local language, or renovation, which started in 1986, that had long-term, holistic, yet granular targets in terms of integrated economic reforms. It looked at macro reforms, it looked at land reforms, it looked at business environment or investment climate reforms, it looked at tax and trade reform. And as I said, when they were doing it, they had very good motivation or ambitions, which were grounded on realities in front of them, and they sort of targeted the reforms to those motivation and possibilities. Land usage reform really helped Vietnam to solve they had similar problems as some of the problems Ali mentioned. They solved that. As Ali very rightly mentioned, land problems exist, but it's also not rocket science or very difficult to solve that, at least for businesses or high priority economic sectors. And Vietnam did that, including for agriculture. One reason they have such high agri-export, agri-process and other agri-export is that they were able to solve their land fragmentation issue, which is required for economies of scale in terms of inputs for agro-manufacturing or agro-processing, by coming up with community-based landfill mechanisms, whereby small parcels of land could be combined and form a large field land which was required to produce something at scale, which would then provide the necessary inputs in a competitive manner to agro-processing industry. Many regulatory reforms for border clearance, the customs, but also overall border clearance, as well as standards. By 2019, 49% of Vietnam's standards were aligned with global requirements. And these standards, not only quality, increasingly environmental and social as well, is now becoming one of the top determinant of any country's success in global value chain participation through exports and so on. And as I mentioned, Vietnam took very strong and effective, efficient advantage of global trade, global bilateral and regional trade mechanism, particularly through free trade agreements. They have more than 16, 17 FTAs with Japan, with European Union. So when this FTA between Vietnam and European Union kicks in fully by next year, Vietnam will be paying only 1% duty on its agro exports to European Union, whereas countries like Bangladesh or Ethiopia may be paying, or particularly Bangladesh, which is graduating out of LDC status in 2 years' time, will have to pay 10% import duty in European markets. So look at the competitiveness edge that Vietnam got. Next slide, please. And I think finally, the final slide, second last, FDI, as I mentioned. The foreign direct investment was instrumental in Vietnam's manufacturing and export-led success. So perhaps the second slide I showed under Vietnam, you saw one graph where it showed how foreign investment through joint venture or foreign direct investment, the companies which had that feature were at the forefront of the export performance. More than 70% of the exports came from firms which had foreign investment, either through joint venture or foreign direct investment. And Vietnam has been receiving consistently 17, 18, 19 billion dollars of actual foreign investment flow every year for the last several years and so on. And then the final slide, as I mentioned, the trade facilitation was a cornerstone because Vietnam's overall growth strategy was export-led, manufacturing export-led. The trade competitiveness would have been extremely important. And in the recent work, after WTO came in, the trade facilitation agreement, the WTO TFA kicked in, the traditional trade competitiveness advantages by solving only trade policies such as tariff, such as global market integration, were no longer the only source of trade competitiveness. Rather, WTO TFA showed the trade facilitation measures were perhaps more important part of trade competitiveness. Ali showed very rightly on the logistics performance index how Vietnam made great advantage. It is ahead of Thailand, it is ahead of Philippines, it is much ahead of Bangladesh. So outpacing and ahead of Indonesia, outpacing its potential competitor. But it also, sort of systematically developed its overall trade facilitation sort of scenario. It allowed foreign direct investments in port and transport infrastructure. It went for significant and targeted time-bound reforms in customs, but also border clearance and standards measures and so on. And all together, and particularly they also enabled FDI in logistics sector. And logistics is a sector which particularly benefits from FDI because it's globally integrated. It requires very sophisticated technology and know-how. And this is something, just a great example of how Vietnam went ahead and Bangladesh kind of fell behind. Bangladesh put a cap on FDI in logistics projects, 49%. And in nobody's sort of good sense, no foreign investor or these global operators like Mars or PSA of Singapore or Dubai Ports World would come and invest heavily, take such great reputational risk by having minority and by not having control on management and board decision. But Vietnam solved this problem right away, and right when they began, and they took off very strongly, and as a result, Vietnam logistics cost in overall business, particularly export, their target is to bring it down to 15% or 16%. Currently, it's about 22 to 23%, whereas in Bangladesh's case, it's more than 40%. So, thank you. Let me stop here. I'll be very happy to respond to any questions, comments, or suggestions. Thank you for your patience. And thank you to Ali and his colleagues at UNDP for having me here for at this very august gathering.